I'm Al Filreis, and this is PoemTalk at the Writer's House, where I have the pleasure of convening three friends in the world of poetry and poetics to collaborate on a close but not too close reading of some poems. We'll talk, maybe even disagree a bit, and perhaps open up the verse to a few new possibilities, and we hope gain for a poem or poems that interest us some new readers and listeners. And I say listeners because PoemTalk poems are available in recordings made by the poets themselves as part of our Pen Sound archive, writing.upenn.edu/pensound. Today, I'm joined very happily here in Philadelphia at the Kelly Writers House in our Arts Cafe by Piyali Bhattacharya, writer, editor, teacher, whose short stories and essays have appeared in Plowshares, Lit Hub, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, National Geographic, and elsewhere, who has edited an anthology titled Good Girls Marry Doctors, South Asian American Daughters on Obedience and Rebellion, who's currently finishing work on her first novel. And I'm thrilled to say Piyali is a colleague of ours here at Penn, where she holds the position of writer-in-residence in the creative writing program, and by Josephine Park, Joe Park, who has directed Penn's Asian American Studies program, teaches modern and contemporary American literature and culture with an emphasis on American poetry and Asian American literature, author of Apparitions of Asia, Modernist Form, and Asian American Poetics and Cold War Friendships, Korea, Vietnam, and Asian American Literature, and co-editor of Asian American Literature and Translation, 1930-1965, published by Cambridge in 2021, not so long ago. Yay, congrats, with Victor Bhaskara. And by Timothy Yu, who joins us here, having made the trip from Madison, Wisconsin, where he is Martha Meyer Renk Bascom Professor of Poetry at the University of Wisconsin, author of Race and the Avant-Garde, Experimental and Asian American Poetry since 1965, many essays and articles, including Form and Identity and Language Poetry and Asian American Poetry, and The Hand of a Chinese Master, Jose Garcia Villa, and Modernist Orientalism, and whose new book has recently been published by Oxford. I'm going to grab it. For those of you watching this as a video, you will now see this marvelous book, Diasporic Poetics, Asian Writing in the United States, Canada, and Australia. Tim, I just blocked my face with that. Tim, congratulations on the book.
Thank you so much,
And
Al.
thank you for making this trip to see us.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
I'm really glad that you're here. And Joe Park, pal, great to see you. Thank you for galloping down the lane to be with us.
My pleasure.
And Piyali, first time on PoemTalk.
First time on PoemTalk. I'm so excited.
Thank you so much, all of you. Well, today we four have gathered here to talk about Divya Victor's book, published by Nightboat Books in 2021. It's called Curb. We'll be focusing on 4 poems in this book from a series under the title More Curbs. We'll be discussing Curb 3, Curb number 3, Curb 4, and Curb 5. And from later in the book, a poem called Frequency, Alka's Testimony. Our recordings of these selections were made specifically for this PoemTalk episode by Divya Victor and have been added to her Pen Sound page. So here now is Divya Victor reading from her book, Curb.
Curb 3, Gold Coast Cafe, Hoboken, New Jersey. Pushed and pulled out the center.
An object described as a brick or a bat.
Toward the building side of the sidewalk was
a path described as from a bar to a car.
Hit a few times.
He
remembered
a man described as bald.
Hitting a fence and
he
slumped to the ground.
A sound made when a name falls from a face.
To the ground. On September 27th, 1987, Navroz Modi, a Zoroastrian, was beaten with bricks and bats by 11 youths who were chanting, "Hindu, Hindu," as he was walking out of the Gold Coast Cafe with his friend, William Crawford. Modi died in hospital 4 days later of trauma to the brain. The assault is often cited in reports about a cluster of incidents perpetrated by the hate group Dotbusters, who specifically targeted any Patel or anyone wearing a dot on their forehead. Curb 4. Subway station, Queens, New York.
Of gray,
Concrete,
rain damp,
battleship water,
sun,
print shop owner,
roommate.
gray.
Of gray,
Asphalt,
smoking bitumen,
wolf fur,
traveler,
entrepreneur,
immigrant.
gray.
Of gray,
Wool,
undyed robes,
bristle collar,
quiet,
an Indian Gregory Peck,
nice.
gray.
Of gray,
Grisaille,
still wet frescoes,
flesh of flesh,
after drinks,
after breakfast,
after dinner.
gray.
Of gray,
Charcoal,
animal bones,
white lead,
a pigment.
an immediate in between. On December 27th, 2012, Sunando Sen, a print shop owner and immigrant who had lived in the United States for 16 years, was pushed off the subway platform and onto the tracks of an oncoming 11-car number 7 train by Erica Menendez. After her arrest, she told the police, "I pushed a Muslim off the train tracks because I hate Hindus and Muslims ever since 2001, when they put down the Twin Towers. I've been beating them up." Curb 5. High school football field, Lawrence Township, New Jersey. To the brown boys on the bleachers, shaking their fists at the black girls on the turf,
And
the brown boys on the bleachers pointing their fingers at the black girls on the turf,
and
the brown boys on the bleachers climbing over each other to hurt the black girls on the turf,
And
the brown boys on the bleachers breaking their throats, screaming death at the black girls on the turf. The same sun that darkens our skin bleaches the cheap boards you stand on. You, a lackey to supremacy, feeling free, winning when you're bootlicking. We want to know, who taught you, brothers, to want whiteness for your kin? Who taught you, brothers, to hate the dark flesh that you're in?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
In October 2019, at a sporting event, two 17-year-old high school students of Indian descent perched on bleachers menaced 4 black students, their peers, by screaming racial epithets and verbally threatening their lives. The young men of Indian descent were performing a familiar policing of space and black bodies. They were establishing their own roles as agents of white supremacy by producing anti-blackness. They were, as Nell Irvin Painter has argued, extending what sociologist Elijah Anderson calls the white space, even though the spaces in question are officially public. When South Asians perform anti-blackness as a form of a centuries-long aspiration to be white, we erase and destroy an equally long history of coalition between black and brown folk, and fail to acknowledge our debt to civil rights processes that have guaranteed the relative freedom of Desis in the United States. Frequency. Alka's testimony. For Serena Chopra. 1. The rate at which something occurs or is repeated over a particular period of time. 2. The rate at which a vibration occurs that constitutes a wave, either in a material, as in sound waves, or in an electromagnetic field, as in radio waves and light. Originally denoting a gathering of people, from Latin frequentia, crowded, frequent. 3 years after the death of her husband, Divyendu Sinha, Alka Sinha appeared at a courthouse in New Brunswick to offer testimony in response to the court's sentencing of the men who were responsible for his death. She began her testimony by playing a recording of Divyendu's voicemail greeting. She closed it by walking away from the podium. His recorded voice and her living voice were buried together in a soundscape of this courtroom. The duration of her entire testimony, documented in these 10 sequences, was 8 minutes.
Well, Tim, since you have traveled the furthest and all deference is owed to you, in a minute, I'm going to ask you to pick one of the pieces where we can start just looking together at it. But prior to that, I'd love for all of you briefly to just tell us or tell readers of this book, guide them, how are we to take the relationship between the poem and those notes, those prose notes? Joe, would you start on that? Is it what is the juxtaposition going on? Is it helpful?
It's striking that the note comes after the poem. I think it would be a very different experience if it preceded that. So I think these poems are about orientation. You know, they have these precise, what do you call these? Coordinates in the corner. And they have locations. So
what are those coordinates? That's the place where the violence occurred?
Yeah.
Did any of you look that up?
I didn't.
You did, Piyali.
She did her homework also.
Well, if I got it right, I'm not sure I'm a great reader of latitude and longitude, but if I am, then they are the specific coordinates of where each of these.
All right.
happened.
Go ahead, Joe.
Oh, well, just to say that, so these poems are about location, clearly, you know, with the coordinates, and then you get the place, you know, the Gold Coast Cafe, Hoboken, New Jersey, in each case, but it's very disorienting, the experience of reading the poem. So it's quite interesting to have the note come after.
Mm-hmm. Tim, what do you think about the relationship between the notes and the poems?
Well, it's interesting because I actually taught this book to my students last semester, and we talked a lot about that question. And, you know, my students were really struck because in a lot of cases, they also often wanted to go to the note first, right? Because they wanted the explanation, you know, what's going on, what's being described. And I think it's really interesting because Victor's obviously choosing to, you know, push that kind of away from us and delay this kind of more narrative explanation. And instead, we get this much more fragmented, even kind of lyrical evocation of what turn out to be these incidents of racist violence. So I think that's because I can only interpret that as, you know, Victor wants us to kind of encounter them in this very estranging way first, in a way that kind of focuses on sort of a linguistic experience, a kind of, you know, often an experience of kind of repetition or of kind of unpacking of certain kinds of words. But there's obviously a kind of ominous sort of undercurrent in a lot of cases, and then the note kind of unfolds or reveals that. I could also imagine them kind of being there without the note entirely, or the note being kind of pushed to the back of the book. And so I think that, you know, I don't yet have a clear answer, but I think that juxtaposition of this kind of more lyric fragmentation and then a very sort of precise narration of the event, putting those together seems to be what Victor wants us to experience.
Piyali, respond in any way you like, including possibly answering or responding to the question I'm about to ask you. Would we, following from Tim's experience in the classroom, would we know, and people listening to the audio won't know that I'm using quotes around know, would we know what happened, quotes again, in each of these scenes of violence or prejudice without the prose note?
You know, that's a really interesting question. I think, you know, Tim just used the phrase fragmented lyric. And, you know, I was noticing that one of the blurbs for this book calls the poems, or says about the poems that they have a fierce lyricism. And I think that, at least for me, I find that if I if I really ask myself to concentrate on the lyric, I can make a guess as to what might have happened here. Not that I'm overly invested in poetry to what actually narratively happened, but I do think that the fierce lyricism, the lyric fragmentation, all these words keep coming up, and I think that is there for a reason. I mean, if we really choose to concentrate on the words asphalt, smoking, grisaille, animal bones, like there are lots of clues here for what it is that happened. And of course, the narrative is helpful in drawing a picture, but I wonder if the project of poetry is to draw such a clear picture always.
Really great. Leading me to another question for Joe and Tim before we let Tim pick a poem to start with. And that follow-up question is, because of the documenting, orienting prose tags, do the poems strike one as less documentary than they might be if they were just presented alone with the tag, in the case of Curb 3, Gold Coast Cafe, Hoboken, New Jersey, as an orientation, but without the prose? Would we feel the poem was documentary? The way it is now is we're challenged to think of the documentary quality as the prose note and the poems as something lyric that's not documentary. Joe and Tim? Did I ask a coherent question?
Yeah, I mean, it's a complex question. I mean, I think this goes back to some earlier conversations we were having about what is documentary poetry, and I think Victor, is exploring that question in a really interesting way. One thing that occurs to me is I feel that maybe the presence of the prose passage afterwards takes a little bit of the documentary weight off of the poem, in the sense that we don't have to say, okay, I mean, I think Piyali is exactly right. We can kind of dig down into the poem and say, okay, we can probably try to reconstruct, but I think the poem is not asking us to just okay, you have to reconstruct exactly what happened from reading this. Rather, these seem to be two kind of parallel approaches to an event or an occurrence, or of evoking some kind of experience. And so I think that I do think lyric is still the right term here, that we have a lyric that is doing kind of what lyric does in parallel to a prose evocation that does what prose does. And so, maybe that does make this less of a kind of documentary poetry and more of a kind of, this is a lyricism that is still grounded in the same event. That's kind of a start of a thought. But
Joe?
I mean, maybe I'll add, the notes are quite complicated on their own, and they offer a lot of contextualizing, the dot busters, so you're getting, the comment by the assailant, Nell Painter, so you're actually getting quite a lot of contextualization in the note, which on the one hand, I think from what you're saying, Tim, it kind of frees the poem in an interesting way, but also these poems are so focused and sensory, like the first one is, or how I might read Curb 3 is like how it feels, Curb 4 is how it looks, So I think it kind of, you get this kind of, I mean, that's what lyrics do. They offer kind of heightened sensory sometimes, Yeah. And so I think it's able to do that in a very compelling way.
Tim, pick one that we can focus on together.
Well, I guess I would start with Curb 3 just because, and one thing that I really struck me was I'm so glad that we had Victor reading the poems, because the experience of hearing her reading really gave me a very different sense of the poem. I mean, just to be, one thing is that looking at the layout of the poem on the page, I did not read the poem kind of across the, the page break, but Victor read straight across. So we got pushed and pulled, and then we go over the page break out of the center. I thought I was kind of reading this side and then this side. And then having the two alternating voices, having two different voices actually read, the sort of Roman versus italicized sections. So I was really fascinated by that play of voices, but also the way in which it kind of makes it's a visual poem. And, and it's one that's kind of being read as if it were kind of scored for the voice in a certain way. So I think that also expands what the poem is doing even beyond kind of conventional lyric and saying, okay, this is a visual poem where things are placed in a certain way. This is a musicality where we've got two different voices playing off of each other. So those are the things that really jumped out at me from hearing the reading.
Thanks, Tim. Great start. So, Joe, Piyali, what can we figure out what those two voices are? This particular scene of violence goes back to 1987, and it is, we are instructed, and we would know, those of us who just simply remembered it from the 80s or looked it up, Googled it, it becomes a locus classicus of anti-Asian violence, is often cited in reports. So that might help us with this double voicedness. It might help us understand the form of the poem. Joe, Piyali, thoughts?
Al, you said the word double voice, and right before that you said that some of us might either remember or have looked up this particular form of violence that was happening in the 80s in New York and New Jersey. And I was thinking about that because when you said double voice, I thought, actually, the place where the poem really lives for me is in the word dot-busters. Because for me, and this might be specific to a South Asian American person who grew up on the East Coast, but that the word dot-busters lives for me neither in my memory, I wasn't old enough, nor did I have to look it up. It lives in my body memory as something that my mother was terrified of when I was growing up in New York.
Terrified for you and for herself.
And for herself, absolutely.
You were, probably 40 minutes at most from Hoboken.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And so as a result, I think that for me, when I read that, again, when I read the poem, I think I had a sense of what was going on. And then when I read the note, this was one of the notes that really sort of hit for me in a way that I was like, okay, so this is a world that I have like a bodily memory of, and therefore it makes, if not a mind memory of, and therefore it makes a lot of sense to me, this idea of pushed and pulled out of the center, and then the second voice there coming in to sort of say, okay, what's doing the pushing and pulling? What are the objects there, and are they objects of menace?
Thank you. Joe?
Yeah, I mean, again, like Tim, the reading is a revelation. I mean, first of all, she is such a beautiful reader, but, to read across the page, it's actually very... Obviously, it feels kind of sustained, and then what you realize is that he, hanging out at the far end, is much different than what you thought as like a collection of he's at the end, right? I mean, you see that it's kind of threading through that he in the poem.
He is more menacing as a pronoun with the way it was performed here than otherwise?
Or it's connected in a way, because I thought, the way I read it the way you did, Tim, it's like he remembered, and he to the ground, it becomes a kind of concluding thing. But when it's threaded through, yeah, I don't know. It's a surprising difference.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I do think it creates a different kind of continuity. He remembered a man described as bald, and he slumped to the ground. So that it does. I mean, interestingly, it creates a little bit more of a narrative, but at the same time, it also, it does put the he in a different context. I mean, I'm still thinking through like what's the relationship between the italicized words that here were voiced in in a different voice than in the Roman words, but I'm still thinking about
Let's close read one of the italicized phrases. We don't have despite PoemTalk being a close reading podcast, we don't really do that much down at the level of the line, but I think this might be the moment.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to go from and he near the end on the right, on the recto, and he, and then this is the phrase I'm hoping we'll work on, a sound made when a name falls from a face. So if you're reading quickly and thinking about the scene of violence, you're thinking of someone falling with his face to the ground. But that's not what is said. So who wants to start on this? Piyali's nodding, so I guess you want to start us off? This is what you get for nodding.
Well, I think that I'm nodding at a sound made when a name falls from a face. And I think that that phrase, I actually think for me that's one of the great signifiers of what this poem is about, even if I didn't have the sort of note afterwards. A name falling from a face is not just a body falling to the ground, nor is it he falling to the ground.
What's the difference?
I think that in this case particularly, it would depend on what that person's name was, and name is very attached to identity, and face is also very, very attached to identity. And but when you take the two apart, a name is a signifier, whereas a face is more of an internal expression. And when the two are divorced, then they don't make sense as a unit anymore, and therefore the body doesn't make sense as a unit anymore.
Joe?
And kind of a basic, when a name falls from a face, when you lose particularity and you become a face, a mass, apparel, that's what I see. But that line is so striking if you compare it to the other lines in italics, like described as, right? And that you get like reporting after the fact, right? It was an object described as, a path. So it's actually incorporated some of the tone of the note that follows, into the poem, but then a sound
Meaning
made,
it's like it's
reporting.
Reporting from some kind of witnessing.
Exactly.
The witness described something as a something.
Mm-hmm. But a sound made when a name, it's both more immediate but less. There is no sound for that. But it's told in that same kind of passive, verb tense. But then when a name falls from a face is in that's the active. That's what happened at the moment of the attack, is that you lost this particularity.
Yeah, I think that names end up being so crucial in this book. I think that, my students and I also talked a lot about the kind of prefatory page where Victor actually names, several of the victims of this anti-South Asian violence, and, says very pointedly, may their names never be forgotten, and their names are listed. But what's interesting in these curb poems, right, exactly. What's interesting in these curb poems is that in the first section of the poem, the names are never given. They're withheld until the note. And then the notes begin generally by naming them. And so the idea of the name falling from the face seems to be that action which kind of, departicularizes, dehumanizes them, and that then Victor is trying to kind of work against. And so, right, it's the physical violence, he slumped to the ground. It's also the kind of the racist violence. This is, you don't have a name, you're not an individual, you are simply, an Indian, you are simply someone I want to attack. So I see that that kind of violent action, a name falling from a face, as being the action that Victor's trying to call attention to, and then but that also suggests that maybe these initial poems are kind of an attempt to portray what that act of stripping away the name is.
Does it matter that we don't know who the witnesses are, who is giving this testimony, who is speaking somewhat either from memory, somewhat indistinct memory, or I wasn't close enough to see whether it was a brick or a bat? Does it matter that we I mean, following from Tim saying that the names have been stripped, both on the side of the victims and on the side of certainly the perpetrators and on the side of the witnesses. And presumably some of these people are witnesses. Maybe all of the second voice in the Curb 3 are witnesses. Does it matter?
Well, it's interesting because following from what you were saying about Tim, about name, I mean, if you go back to the note, there is a name, it's Patel, who specifically targeted any Patel. So
But that's not naming a person. That's
No.
that's a genre almost. Right?
exactly, but that's what happened, but you get the proper name is, on the one hand, you have the name of this, murdered man, but then you get this kind of other, that's the name that he's been assigned. And then here, the assault is often cited in reports about, again, even in the note, it doesn't even say witnesses.
And how does the or function, Piyali? It's a weird or. For those who don't know the specific politics, who specifically targeted any Patel or anyone wearing a dot on their forehead?
Well, the or is interesting because if I'm reading names correctly, and if I'm reading all the politics associated with names correctly, Navroz Modi would have been neither a Patel nor somebody who wore a dot on their forehead. So it would have been just a brown person.
And a Zoroastrian,
and a
which is
Zoroastrian.
really marginal, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I'm assuming that the Patel is there because in New Jersey at the time, the largest sort of number of South Asians that were there were probably Gujarati, probably of the Patel sect. So there were a lot of Patel last names sort of floating around New Jersey at the time. But the or, anyone wearing a dot on their forehead, first of all, a dot on their forehead would have to be a woman. And secondly, again, it makes no sense for Navroz Modi specifically, neither the Hindu part nor the dot part.
Yeah, really. Okay, so let's go from a text from Curb where the name is not used in the poem to frequency, parenthesis, Alka's testimony, which is, the other three poems are from the Curb sequence. This is a little different, although it does have a note. The poem is an abstraction, and the title of the poem is an abstraction with the parentheses meaning it comes from a particular person whom we are informed was a member of the victim's family and who later bore witness. The poem itself defines an abstraction, and yet it's directly connected to a very specific act of violence. All right, who wants to? So it's quite a shift, although we have Alka. We have testimony. Presumably, Alka is telling us about frequency. I guess, Tim, your job, since you're the special guest, you came from far away, your job is to explain why Alka's testimony would be a definition, two different ones, of frequency.
Well, my students and I also did spend quite a bit of time talking about this poem and the sequence that it's a part of. And, my understanding of what's kind of being portrayed here is that Alka Sinha is that her husband was murdered, and so she, as her testimony, what's fascinating about this is that, and I think why Victor's so fascinated by it is her testimony was not her own words. What she did was she played a voicemail message that had been left by her, or I think either his greeting or she played his voicemail greeting. So
in court,
as at the sentencing of his assailants, and so she let his voice speak. But what's interesting is that Victor does not reproduce his words, nor does she use Alka's own words really directly. Instead, she talks about kind of the sounds and the frequency of the sounds and
so this is a reference to sound.
Yes, that's how I'm
okay.
seeing
Let's just stipulate that. That's cool, and come back to it. What are some other nominees for definitions of frequency? Sound for sure. Joe, you're on the spot. What else would frequency be?
Well, she's very helpfully given us these definitions. The the rate at which something occurs.
Meaning frequent violence.
Yeah. Yeah.
Piyali, is there another sense of frequency?
That was my guess. It was this idea that if we're going to use the word frequency for this woman's testimony, a woman who has had to live through the violence against her own husband and is sort of performing a soundscape for the court in response to that. That soundscape is also not existing in a world in which these things happen infrequently.
And I'll add a fourth definition, then we'll go back to the first, because I think that's really important. The Latin definition, the etymology, is sociality. And as in, I frequented
Right.
that place, which is not really, I went often, although that's what we probably mean when we talk about frequenting a restaurant or a favorite bar. But what we're really saying etymologically is that we go to see other people, to be with other people. We have a suburban home. This man was assaulted mere yards away from his suburban home, which raises a question about whether a brown family could be okay in the suburbs, be safe. Clearly, no.
Not.
The answer is, right? Isn't that the kind of nightmare that you're recalling as a child?
100%. My parents were living in Queens when I was born, and they and many of their friends frequented the suburbs as soon as they could afford to.
And your family did as well at some point.
Certainly, and because they felt that it would be safer. And there are many of us who would say, even if we have survived it, it wasn't. But this is a much more clear example of the fact that this was physically extremely to the maximum unsafe.
So, as a fourth definition provided by her, frequency is the sociality that can be the illusion of community and safety. Powerful stuff. Okay, Tim, back to you on the sound. Do you mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's less evident, I think, in these particular sections that we've read as in some of the later sections of the poem, but I'll try to focus kind of on here. I mean, I think
vibration is in this poem.
Yes, so we were really interested in why is Victor interested in not in like the semantic content of the sounds, but kind of in the sound as a vibration, or the sound defined as a frequency. And I think, to me, and this is where like Victor often is in kind of a tradition with writers like Teresa Ha-Kyung Cha or other kinds of writers who say, what I'm interested in is kind of the materiality of history. And, it's like we often say, okay, well, a person's words, a person's testimony, like what they speak, that's history. And in a lot of cases, history can't be captured that way. We don't necessarily have that person's words, or it's not a transparent window into their experience. And Victor's saying, is there a way in which the vibrations themselves, the kind of pauses between the words, the spaces between the words, the frequency at which somebody's voice vibrates, like, can that tell us something? How is that a window into an experience that's kind of lost or missing? So I see that as part of why she's interested in kind of frequency and vibration, because those are not semantic concepts. You can't tell what something means by measuring its frequency, but you learn something else about the quality of the sound. That seems to be what she's interested in, to me.
And this could lead us back to poetry as a medium, because poetry isn't just about what the semantic sense of what the words mean. It is about all those other things, the sound and vibrations between and among the words, the voice speaking. I mean, poetry is sound.
Yes.
Because if it were not electromagnetic sound wave vibration like, it would just be denotation, Yeah, that's cool. Okay, Joe, take us back. Your definition was frequency. The one you offered was frequency, meaning it keeps happening again and again. Do you want to elaborate on that?
I mean, I think, well, on a basic level, these kinds of attacks have not let up. And honestly, if anything, they're much worse now. Although they're pretty bad.
As we record in this period, right?
Yeah, I mean, they've never gone away, and they've actually never abated. But one thing that's quite striking here is that, in contrast to the Curb poems, you get the note right away, at the top here, and in the way that Tim was saying that the poems themselves don't have to do all the reporting, in those other, because there's a note coming after. In this case, we get the note first, and then we just get but we get these sounds that I think kind of reproduce the experience of the courtroom, so that we don't hear what anybody says, but we get this very full audioscape of that courtroom experience. So if it goes back to your question earlier about witnessing, Al, and the other poems, who's they, who are the witnesses. Here we're getting like this kind of in-depth, blow-by-blow, like witnessing of this weird soundscape that emerges in the courtroom.
Yeah. So you've actually merged the two first definitions.
True.
Yeah, right. The frequency of the violence, of the hateful racist violence, and the sound that frequency makes. A kind of incoherent, coherent buzzing. There's a vibration going on yet again in that place. Okay, let us go to one of the other two curbs. Piyali, you get to pick. It's either 4 or 5.
Then how can we not choose the man who was a print shop owner?
Okay. Where would you like us to start? Why don't you ask a question?
Well, I actually think, if I may just actually take off from Tim and Joe's points about the frequency and testimony, and which is actually connected to an earlier point you were making about who is the audience and who is the witness. I can't seem to separate in my mind the fact that especially frequency, the poem, is happening inside a courtroom. The where of it really matters to me. And the idea that sound, Tim said the word sort of materiality of history. I mean, what is a court invested in if not recreating a very specific kind of history? And therefore, the idea that sound vibrations can give a sense of a man that that maybe even spoken histories or written histories or visual histories cannot, very much matters to me in our reading of all of this, right? Because I think that if I'm to come to Curb 4, subway station, Queens, New York, I think I have to remember that whether or not this particular poem is happening in the court or happening for the court, it is like the first Curb poem was, an act of witness, and it is us witnessing that witness in addition to anything else. Which is why, again, the sort of Victor's reading of the poem was such a revelation, because again, that sort of reading across the page break, and I think the poem makes sense either way, whether you read it straight page after page or if you read it across the page break. But I think one of my favorite parts of this poem is that it is such an act of witness.
Wow. So the poem, though it doesn't identify itself as coming from a particular speaker's subject position, is the witness. Can you give us an example of a phrase or word that shows that?
I think that the violence in the poem is as important as the softness. And therefore, I think one of my favorite sort of phrases is gray of gray, wool, undyed robes, bristle collar, quiet. there's a softness there that is rubbing up against the bristle, and that is, of course, juxtaposed with asphalt and with wolf
Concrete
fur
and
and
so
concrete. Yeah.
Yeah. And then a witness's statement probably describing the victim, an Indian Gregory Peck. Let's go there. Tim, what do we do with somebody who says, oh, it was terrible? What did he look like? Well, he was kind of an Indian Gregory Peck.
It's interesting. I mean, this sequence of words, quiet, and Indian Gregory Peck, nice. I think,
gray also.
Right, well, and then, but I mean, all of the things are kind of bracketed by of gray. And so it almost seems like these descriptions kind of emerge from this grayness. They take on some kind of specificity, and then they sort of fall back into this grayness. So, the Indian Gregory Peck is it's a really striking description. It seems like, I don't know, this seems kind of like something that like your neighbors say about you, or that like someone or some reporter is
He
trying
was
to
always
describe.
so nice. Why would this happen to him?
Yes, exactly. Their family was very quiet, or something like that. And, the Indian Gregory Peck could have been something that someone said about him that was, meant to be very kind of complimentary or show kind of like how handsome he was, or something like that. And it both... It's a funny comparison because it both brings out a certain kind of individuality, and yet it only defines him through this like famous white American actor, right? Like he's an Indian version of Gregory Peck, so it kind of marks him racially, even if it's trying to kind of distinguish him. At least that's how that kind of strikes me.
Well, and that's kind of a perfect metaphor for what that line is, right? I think when I'm thinking of softness in this particular poem, I'm thinking of the model minority myth, right? Like there's, neighbors
the Indian
described,
Gregory Peck. Yeah, got
right.
it.
Neighbors described him as quiet. Neighbors described him as nice. Such a quiet, nice man. This is the perfect Asian, right?
Yeah.
Like this is the perfect Asian who never made noise and never rocked the boat.
As if
and
it's
never...
more tragic if he is killed
Exactly.
by anti-Asian violence, as opposed to someone who is
Right.
Noisy.
not model.
Right. I wonder, so what's so fascinating to me about this is such a painterly poem. It says grisaille, which I looked up, as a method of painting in gray monochrome.
And frescoes.
Frescoes. We see an actual subway tile, right? And so here, this is a portrait of the subway and the subway station, gray, battleship. I can see, the animal bones. I see that in the subway, And so I'm sorry to do this. I can't help but think of In a Station of the Metro, and how like.
Why are you sorry?
Well, I don't know, but but
you've written about Pound in relation to Asian American poetry.
I have, but like still wet frescoes, petals on a wet black belt.
Absolutely,
it's hard
right?
So you see this kind of beauty emerge in the subway, but here you're getting the onslaught of the subway. Rain damp. Remember, in a station of Metro, it was like wet.
Yes.
So the rain damp, the battleship water, gray. So this is not the flowers that emerge from the people's faces in the subway. This is a moment of brutality when a person is beaten into animal bone.
Yes.
Right in the subway.
But it is still an apparition.
It is still an
And
apparition.
it's a title word for you. So say a little more, please. Why apparition?
Well, one of the imagism, that's where I drew
And
apparition.
this is an
imagist poem.
Sure.
So, obviously, how imagism operates is that the image flashes before your eyes as the reader. And in many ways, in an imagist poem, the reader completes the poem, right?
And we have to, in the erasure poetry moment.
Exactly.
We have to complete it.
Yeah, and so in a way, it's so interesting. It says an Indian Gregory Peck. That's a very image-centric, cinematic, not like his face looked like that. She wants, I think, that kind of flash in the subway of this person who was murdered in the subway. So, I think the way the appearance, the apparition is astonishing here.
I think she's turning, Joe, the Poundian mode, that mode of, again, sociality. The Metro poem is about this amazingness of how I want to be a new kind of poet that can somehow capture the sociality of a crowd of people that are attractive to me, and I'm going to be like a painter. Here, it becomes elegiac. So it is the apparition of lost souls in a crowd.
Absolutely.
And this is an experimental elegy in the sense that it, and what Piyali's been saying is what causes me to say this in this way, it becomes a way of saying, I'm going to write an elegy of a place where this sort of thing could happen, the 7 train going into
Absolutely.
Queens. This is so I am going to elegize a space because we have the unsafe space of the roadside diner, we have the unsafe space of your own suburban home, we have the unsafe space of the New York City subway system. And we mourn that space, and so I'm going to describe it. That is experimental elegy, I think.
And the subway's spectacularly unsafe right now. I mean, that is the site of this violence.
There's pandemic plus. I mean, the pandemic, the evacuation of lots and lots of people, because crowd density makes places generally safer. Without that density, you have more violence, and the hate comes through more than ever. Well, now we get politically more complicated as we go to Curb 5. Does anybody want to try to say what the extra complication here is? I mean, it's obvious, but it still needs to be said.
Well, we're layering another race here.
Yeah. Why does she include this? Because it really is so much less straightforward. Not that anything else is straightforward, but...
Well, I have a lot to say about that.
Well,
Let's hear it.
The floor is yours, Piyali, please.
I think just if I can just be abstract for a second, I think one of the reasons why Divya Victor's work is so important to me is that I have been spending a lot of time, especially, and because I teach Asian American literature and Asian American creative writing, and because I have a lot of heritage Asian American students, and because I live in a lot of Asian American spaces, I think one of the things that has been so important for so long, but also particularly in the last couple of years, is addressing Asian anti-blackness and Asian violence against blackness. And that has been a space that, I mean, it is really, if anything, it's the space that we need to be talking about right now. And I think one of the things that Divya Victor's work reminds me of over and over again is that happens because we are victims of the same thing. Like, I think that it is sometimes easy to forget when one is sort of like wanting to really deeply examine where sort of Asian anti-blackness comes from and to explain to students like, hey, this is a real thing that happens and you need to believe it and you need to do something about it. That it's easy to forget sometimes that like if you are an Asian person, like that is a violence that has been enacted upon you as well, and that is why you are enacting that violence. And she even says in the note, she has a whole note, a slightly lengthier note here about performance of policing and performance of violence. But I think that this book as a work of witness of anti-Asian violence makes it very clear to me where Asian anti-blackness comes from, and it just underlines that point in a way that I sometimes need reminding of. And so I think that's why this poem is in there, and my poems like
to
this
do that, yeah. Tim, the structure of this thing is pointed. It begins with to, it's an address, and then a lot of to, so to this, to them, to these, and then a colon, and now that must be the message. So first, maybe comment on the address, or as an option, comment on what comes after the colon, which is presumably the speaker's or Divya Victor's message, which complicatedly ends with 5 blanks that you're supposed to fill in, because I guess you're supposed to learn the lesson yourself.
Yes.
Anyway.
Yes. I do think, the address of the poem is really striking, and it is a shift from the other poems. Well, and to pick up on, Piyali's points, I think that's exactly right, that Victor is very engaged in this conversation about anti-blackness in the Asian American community. and that's why this poem can be addressed to, right? I mean, I think the other poems, I think, elegy is a great term for them, poems of witness is a great term for them, but they're not really addressed to, right? They're not sort of saying like, calling out like, white assailants or something. That's not their mission. Here, I think it's in part because the speaker believes that there is a chance that the people she's speaking to will listen or hear this message because they are kind of within, Victor's previous book is called Kith. And so I think a lot about that in terms of her work, in terms of who is Kith, like who is included in the group that she wants to speak to and for. And this is a moment where, on one hand, she's kind of speaking for and about a South Asian community. On the other hand, she's here speaking to other members of
and
that.
And kin is a word used here.
Yes,
in this poem,
exactly.
Right? Who taught you, brothers, to want whiteness for your kin?
Yes, exactly. And so that's a recurring theme for her. And so I think that very direct, like you, a lackey to supremacy. She really, if there's any ambiguity in any of the other poems, there's none here.
No.
It's very
the only
straight.
ambiguity is the way it ends with those blanks.
Yes, and that's also a very characteristic move in Victor's poetry. I can think of other poems of hers from Kith, for example, where she uses that same kind of fill in the blanks structure. Who taught you to hate the dark flesh that you're in? But then
name the 5 people who taught you.
Right, exactly.
Right? Is that what's going on there?
And well, it's interesting because at some level, the answer kind of seems obvious, sort of white supremacy, but then it's not obvious at all in that, okay, but that white supremacy had to be kind of propagated by someone. It had to be, people in our own community propagate that
well, I'm going to overread this.
Please.
Because this is Lawrence, New Jersey, which is a quite wealthy place. And they're students. It's a high school football field. These are students. So the literal and overreading answer to who taught you are the teachers. Right. And this would probably be an all-white teaching staff. I'm probably going to get fan mail, or not the opposite of fan mail, from Lawrence Township teachers. So what if we have white teachers teaching brown brothers to hate black brothers? And there are 5 of them at the end we could name. Any of us maybe could name, which is why there's such blankness there. Sorry, I overread it, but I really think that the location here, since we've been focusing on locations, and she directs us to go to the map and see where Lawrence Township is. I mean, it could even be Lawrenceville, a famous private prep school.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's also kind of noticeable. There are 5 blanks. This is curb number 5. I wonder, we have these... There are 5 bad influences, but here you have 5 poems that maybe you could learn from. But, I noticed color in this one too. Just to state the obvious, it's a very narrow color range between brown and black. It's too bad that we don't see the connections between them. But, obviously in this poem, as she says quite plainly, the problem between brown and black in this case is that brown thinks they can bleach, and get paler. Right.
And since I'm in a mood of overreading, bleaching the cheap boards. So these are the whitening football field stands. They're whitening, and in the sun, these people are darkening, which creates an irony. Yeah. So, but I don't think that Erica Menendez and the other killers are in that list of 5, Joe.
No.
Right? If those are the 5 poems, just the neat thing, because we're picking 5.
Yeah.
I think those are people who are unwittingly teaching white supremacy to their brown students.
Definitely.
Piyali, what do you think?
I think it could also be the boys on the playground. I actually think we can overread as teachers. We can also overread as just the other kids. Who are the other? There are clearly kids who are on that playground who are not brown or black, who are on that field who are neither brown nor black, who are on those bleachers and in those seats that are neither brown nor black. And for me, the overwhelming feeling I got was that the fill in the blanks are coming from the people that these brown boys are trying to impress, which is likely to be their peers.
And we haven't talked about how the catcalling or racist boys are shouting at black girls. All right, we could talk. I mean, Tim probably spent a month on this book in his class, so we could spend a month on this, but we don't have time less. So let us go for a round, each of us, final thought. What did you come here wanting to say about this book or these poems that you haven't had a chance to yet? We want to hear. So, Tim, what do you got?
Well, I'll go back one more time to the classroom and say that when I asked my students at the end of the term what their favorite book of the term was, the most powerful one, they largely named this book. And I think that and I think a lot of that has to do with exactly this kind of dynamic between the two sort of parallel tracks that Victor takes, the kind of the lyricism and the kind of documentary narrative kind of juxtaposed, and the kind of work that does. And a lot of my students said that the reason Victor seemed to speak to this moment is that there was that kind of forthrightness. There was that kind of pointing to like the specificity of the political moment, even at the same time that Victor wants to kind of complicate and fragment and lyricize and elegize and do all those things that kind of poetry can traditionally do. At the same time, she says, but remember their names. Remember where this happened. I'm going to tell you those things. Don't forget them. So I think that the reason, the book for me is so powerful, not just as a kind of example, but as a method, is that it shows the way in which contemporary poetry can do both of those things, can kind of powerfully bring kind of lyricism and political critique together. So that's a more general statement about the book's method, but I think it's really characteristic of what this book does well.
Fabulous. Thank you, Tim. Joe, final thought?
I'll just piggyback on what Tim is saying. May their names never be forgotten from the opening note. I will say, in these past seasons of anti-Asian violence, I think there's been a real longing to have our own litany of names, to recite names as we do in Black Lives Matter protests. Like we say those names. We don't have that practice in the Asian American community, and it's actually really important.
And
Can you
often
say
those
a
names
little?
are harder to say.
I'm sorry, Piyali.
No.
Can you say that again?
No, I was just saying, and often those names are harder to say.
Yeah, but yeah, absolutely. So it's like we don't have that I mean, I think, and in a lot of the talks and stuff I've given, there's there's just one name that people know, and so like doing that work of having these names out here, I think this is what we can chant these names, and that I think that actually has it. That's how we show that these people matter.
Piyali, final thoughts?
I wonder if that chanting goes back to sound, Joe. Also. But I think for me the thing that I love about this work, this entire piece of work, is I think that one of my sort of writerly and readerly obsessions is sort of creating texture within immigrant communities, because I think one of the things that gets erased a little bit when we use the word immigrant is how much diversity there is even within the immigrant experience. And I think Divya Victor, though she's focusing on violence against South Asians, there are so many textures of immigrancy that exist in this book. Even, this idea that like Zoroastrian would be neither a Patel nor a dot on their forehead, or this idea that like, the print shop owner hates Hindus and Muslims, but her name is Erica Menendez, which potentially could be a non-white person, that's, there are so many different layers here of race and immigrant. And I think that's one of the things that this book does so well, is that it's talking about anti-Asian violence, which can sometimes be a kind of monolith, and it's breaking it down into its little parts via lyric and via sound and Tim was saying that it's part of the power of modern poetry, and I think that's kind of what she does here.
Thank you. My final thought is somewhat obvious, but really a matter of stressing something that I find important in one of the notes, and that is the note to the last poem we discussed, with its reference to how South Asians perform anti-blackness as a form of a centuries-long aspiration to be white. And there's no further elaboration, and it doesn't take a lot to think about for anyone to learn to teach themselves what that centuries-old aspiration is. Of course, it has to do with European colonialism and settling. And the second part of that sentence is referring to the erasure and destruction of an equally long history of coalition between black and brown folk. I mean, what strikes me is I would have said ignorantly that the aspiration to be white on the part of a South Asian must predate and be longer than the coalition of brown and black, but that is not the case. They basically coincide. Well, we like to end Poem Talk with a minute or two of Gathering Paradise, a chance for several of us, or if you're quick, all of us, to spread wide our narrow hands to gather a little something really poetically good to hail or commend someone or something going on in the poetry world or the literary world or the film world or the anything world. So, Joe, you always remember to do Gathering Paradise. What would you like to recommend?
Well, I'm going to cheat today and choose what Tim. So I'm going to choose from Tim's really incredible work in recentering Janice Mirikitani. So I will recommend, and Tim shared with us there's a new reissue of Janice Mirikitani's poetry, and I think we need to return to that movement period of activism for Asian American poets, especially in a moment that's presented in Curb.
I invite you to put an even wilder, emphatic point on that. Because earlier today you were just like very radical in the way you said that. Do you want to do a radical version of what you just said?
Well, I mean, it's
time to do what?
Yeah. Well, I mean, to say Asian, that word Asian is a political solidarity. To claim being Asian, not as a kind of ethnic description, but as a radical and racial understanding, a moment of solidarity.
Thank you very much. Tim, Gathering Paradise. You've already done your final thought. This is a combo.
Well, actually, Joe, you kind of snuck in too there. So I think that, I'll echo so the University of Washington Press has put out this new edition of Janice Mirikitani's first two books, Awake in the River and Shedding Silence. And I think having those books back in print is really a remarkable moment and opportunity for us to kind of, go back to this radical tradition in Asian American writing, one that I think that, in their very different ways, writers like Victor are trying to kind of continue, one that's kind of grounded in these sort of historical injustices and violence, but most importantly, maybe pointing to that coalition, pointing to that idea that, these kinds of anti-racist, anti-imperialist coalitions are really what kind of Asian American identity, writing, politics is sort of grounded in. So I think Mirikitani is a great writer to kind of remind us of that.
Fantastic. Piyali?
Well, since we're talking about South Asians and since we're talking about New Jersey, I actually thought that the person who comes to mind and whose work has been coming to mind just over and over again since I read it several years ago when it came out is Gayatri Bahadur's nonfiction work called Coolie Woman, in which she documents her family's journey. They were indentured laborers in Guyana, but they are ethnically Indian, and she documents her family's journey to the United States and to New Jersey specifically. But of course, that families and families like it are very interesting in the sense that they were ethnically South Asian. They remained ethnically South Asian even throughout their long tenure in South America, and they, to this day, from what I can tell, remain ethnically South Asian. But speaking of, Alex, to your earlier point, coalitions between brown and black people, I mean, when South Asian indentured labor was brought to South America, there was an enormous amount of racism and also an enormous amount of coalition building between brown and black and Afro-Latin people. And there's Gayatri documents all of that tremendously and also goes into sort of like radical histories really beautifully. And anybody looking at South Asia and New Jersey, I think, needs to read Gayatri's work.
Thank you. My Gathering Paradise, we have Tim Yu here, who is Paradise. And this paradisal friend of ours has a new book out, Diasporic Poetics. The subtitle is Asian Writing in the United States, Canada, and Australia, talking about Asian Canadian poet, Asian Australian poet, thinking about Asian American studies. It is a marvelous book. It kind of tries to, well, kind of is the wrong word. It redefines what Asianness might mean, at least in the poetic context. And it reflects on a certain pointed belatedness of the Asian Canadian or Asian Australian turn. Highly recommend it. It's put out by Oxford. Tim, congratulations on this book. It is amazing. Well, that's all the sound made when a name falls from a face we have time for on Poem Talk today. Poem Talk at the Writers' House is a collaboration of the Center for Programs in Contemporary Writing and the Kelly Writers' House of the University of Pennsylvania and the Poetry Foundation, poetryfoundation.org. Thanks so much to my guests, Joe Park, Tim Yu, Piyali Bhattacharya, and to Poem Talk's director and engineer today, Zach Gardner, a person behind two cameras and the audio. And I would insist that he turn the camera on himself, but it just doesn't turn that far, I don't think. and amazing job, Zach. Thank you. And to Poem Talk's editor, who happens to be the same amazing Zach Gardner. And a shout out to Nathan and Elizabeth Light for their very generous support of Poem Talk. Next time on Poem Talk, I'll be talking with Caroline Bergvall, Bethany Swan, and Piyali Bhattacharya about Sawako Nakayasu's book, Some Girls Walk into the Country They Are From. This is Al Filreis, and I hope you'll join us next month for that or another episode of Poem Talk.